Hi there. In this video, we're going to talk about how watching porn affects your relationships. My name is Christopher Linkenbach, and I'll be guiding us through this presentation today. So just to start off this conversation, I wanted to provide a couple of statistics around pornography usage today. One of the main arguments that's happening within the scientific community right now is even arguing about whether or not pornography addiction is real. And I want to make the case that pornography addiction is very much a real addiction. It is currently not being published in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, which is the book that psychiatrists, therapists, and doctors use to diagnose mental disorders within individuals. And I want to make the case that pornography addiction very well deserves a seat at the table of these other disorders and addictions. And this is an addiction that is as serious as other addictions and can lead to death, just like other addictions as well. Pornography addiction is something that has affected my own life. And so I do know firsthand how destructive that pornography addiction can be. So, just a couple of statistics here to sort of talk about pornography addiction to help kind of provide some context about what's happening in our society today. So, over on the right here, we have a couple of percentages. And so, these are percentages from the Huffington Post that provide how much during a certain age demographic of monthly use individuals have. So, this is if an individual used within the last month and they checked yes to that box, then that is the percentage that is ascribed to that age demographic. So for the ages of 18 to 30, nearly 80% of men, so 79% of men ages 18 to 30 are currently watching pornography at least once a month. And I want to also talk about how drastic of a number that is. That means that every time you're walking out on the street, every time you pass five men, that four of those five men have watched pornography in the last month. And if we can think about for a second what that is doing to the collective psyche about just objectifying people in general, how we are training ourselves to walk around in the state of constantly seeking and looking at others in order to get high. Are they attractive? Do they want to have sex? This constant objectification of other men and women that is created through the use of pornography, and how pornography trains our brains to actually look at human beings through this lens. And if 80% or nearly 80% of young men are watching that, think of what that's doing to our relationships at this age period, and how difficult it can be to actually have healthy relationships at this point in our life if we're watching this much pornography. And so as we go up in the demographic, the age demographic, the percentages do drop off a little bit. So at ages 31 to 49, about 2/3 of men are watching pornography. And then at ages 50 to 68, about 49% of men are watching pornography. So in all of these age demographics, it's pretty significant how much pornography is actually being consumed. And I would say that not only this doesn't show necessarily that pornography just drops off over time. I do believe that this is because ages 18 to 30 are the individuals right now who have currently been exposed to an upbringing with social media, and upbringing with pornography usage through their mobile devices, whereas the other generations didn't have that same level of access when they were younger. So it just maybe didn't take hold in that same way. When I started watching pornography, I was in seventh grade. So just thinking back to how that would have affected me and my development as an individual, many young men and young boys start watching pornography at very, very early ages, and that can really start impacting and affecting the brain very early on. How we perceive sex and relationships, and how we perceive coping mechanisms, as well as ways that we can alleviate stress and seek pleasure too. And so, just to also provide a little more context around the seriousness of pornography addiction, this is a graph here that sort of outlines a couple of things. And I'll pull up the next slide because it gets a little bit bigger for us to examine. So, on the left here, on this axis, we have the amount of dopamine that each activity or substance creates. And then on the bottom here, we have the amount of time after the substance is used or the activity is partaken in that the substance lasts for. So as we can see, we have a couple of different items here. So we have food, which has a very relatively small spike after ingesting or eating, and then over time slowly wanes as well, and sort of is very neutral throughout the entire process. It doesn't have when it leaves, it doesn't have a huge decline. Next, we have nicotine, which has a very sharp sort of drastic increase, and then peaks around hour 2 and slowly starts to decline throughout the rest of the day. Next, we have sex. So sex is a pretty instant incline with a decline as well. And I also want to acknowledge that with these declines, just because we don't no longer feel the effects of the substance or activity doesn't mean that the dopamine levels still haven't returned to normal yet. So over on the left here, we have amphetamines. So the amphetamine spike is extremely high, and the crash is also extremely devastating as well, as we can see with that. Cocaine is a little bit more of a gradual rise, and then still a pretty heavy crash as well. And then as we talk about pornography here, I want to talk about a couple things that are pretty significant. So first of all, when we have the instant increase of pornography, so after watching pornography, there's an extremely sharp increase of dopamine levels until about the hour mark. And then what's different about pornography addiction than these other addictions here is that the pornography addiction doesn't have that same level of crash. So with men who use pornography, you can actually kind of see that there's a slight increase even in the dopamine levels here before there's a drop off around hour 2. And even if it's slight increase, but it also just plateaus, whereas the other substances or activities actually drop off after. So with this slight increase, it's really common for pornography addicts to watch pornography for a lot of hours during the day without actually being able to take their eyes away from the screen. And that's because there's this consistent level of dopamine that's occurred. Now, what's going on with the brain when we have this consistent level of dopamine is that this becomes our new threshold. This becomes our new normal baseline for our dopamine. And so what we're going to constantly be trying to do is to hit that level of dopamine. Another significant fact about this graph is that the pornography addiction, the pornography dopamine levels are actually either just as high, if not a little bit higher than sex. And sex is the activity that produces the most dopamine in our bodies that is a naturally occurring process within our bodies. And so pornography, not only does pornography produce more dopamine, but it also lasts longer as well. Sex will have that decrease. So pornography produces more dopamine and will last longer. And so I think that's also really significant to bring into the conversation as well. So also to put into context, so January 1st, 1983 is considered the official birthday of the internet. So that means at the time of shooting this video in December 2023, that 40 years have passed since the inception of the internet. And less time has passed since it's become more mainstream and people actually begun using the internet. So that's really significant because it shows that our brains have not had a lot of time to catch up to the amount of dopamine that we're showing them. 40 years is not a long time in terms of our evolutionary process that lasts hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, especially in contrast to how our ancestors were living, even within the last couple of hundred years, if not thousands of years ago. Our amount of stimulus and dopamine that we are putting into our bodies today is way more than what our brains are actually used to. And whether or not you love him or hate him, I definitely have mixed feelings towards Jordan Peterson. He does have a quote about this, which is that in one afternoon, a young man today can see more naked women than an entire man could see in his life in the 1800s. And I think that's pretty significant to show just how our brain chemistry has not quite caught up to the amount of pornography that we are consuming today. So with this graph here, something really a profound quote that I found that I'm going to read to you goes as follows. So dopamine ensures that the brain will remember and later crave the activities that led to the high. The bottom line is that drugs like cocaine, meth, and porn are all rooted in chasing a high that dopamine won't let them forget. So I just want to acknowledge that dopamine creates a high that is way higher and also longer lasting than food, than even nicotine, and then also sex. So creating intimate relationships with other people as well. And also this part here, so dopamine ensures that the brain will remember and later crave the activities that led to the high. So not only do we get addicted to porn, but we get addicted to everything else that's happening in our life, in our day-to-day. So if we're not working out, if we're sitting at home playing video games, if we're watching Netflix all day, if we're eating unhealthy foods, if we're not going outside and we're isolating, but we're still watching porn, our brain is tricked into thinking that we are getting what we need to get because we're getting enough dopamine. And so the seduction and the trick of pornography addiction is not only does it create this idea that we're doing okay, but it actually keeps us trapped in our cycles to keep us using as well. So there's a very seductive and clinging cycle that we can get sucked into with pornography addiction. So chasing dopamine can also be so consuming that people risk it all: their job, marriage, ministry, and integrity. I think that's really important to understand. And the reason this happens is with any addiction, typically what we do, as I mentioned previously, is there's a threshold of dopamine that's created in our day to day. And when we're constantly using something, that threshold of dopamine actually decreases as our brain tries to enter into a state of homeostasis. As our brain tries to balance out our chemicals and knows that it's going to be getting a lot of dopamine later today from pornography or cocaine, it will produce less dopamine throughout the day. This means that if we don't end up using our dopamine particular substance or activity of choice, so if we don't end up using pornography, we'll experience a huge dip underneath our normal baseline of dopamine levels. And when our dopamine levels at one point were up here, that might have been okay when it was a normal, healthy brain. But now that our dopamine levels have dropped down here, that dip is a very scary process to the brain. That dip, because our brain is conditioned to find dopamine in order to survive, means that our brain goes into a crisis state. So if we don't watch pornography, even though not watching pornography may not actually kill us, our brain goes into a state thinking that not watching pornography is going to kill us. And so therefore we have not only this pleasure-seeking cycle, but now we have this ingrained behavior pattern that is actually conditioned to quote unquote be saving our life by watching pornography. And so we can get trapped in that cycle of that dopamine fueled craze, just trying to seek dopamine through pornography in order to not feel those drastic withdrawals that can occur in the dopamine cycle. Real quick before we move on, I also want to talk about how that process makes it so clear that choosing to watch pornography over going to work, over developing healthy relationships, over building a business, over working out and taking care of the body can happen is because the brain is so primed to seek out that dopamine that it will seek it out at all costs, regardless of how it treats other people. And so the addiction becomes extremely seductive, selfish, almost narcissistic in nature. And that can happen to any of us. And so that's how pornography can start taking over your life, is that it will start stripping away everything else you need. And in that addiction becomes the sole focus of how can I get this dopamine in my life? And it basically becomes something that we surrender to in a very unhealthy way. And it's almost like a worshiping sense. We can go into that a little bit deeper of how that might archetypally play out. But Gabor Mate, who is an addiction specialist and a physician from Canada, talks about this. And so this is his definition of addiction. I just want to read this to you so we can get on a clear understanding of what addiction is. So to Gabor Mate, my definition of addiction is any behavior that gives you temporary relief, temporary pleasure, but in the long term causes harm, has some negative consequences, and you can't give it up despite those negative consequences. And from that perspective, you can understand that there are many, many addictions. And so I want to also acknowledge here that what he's talking about here is the pleasure-pain cycle. Is that when the brain recognizes that it can either reduce pain or receive pleasure, it's going to become addicted to whatever that is, even if it becomes destructive in the long term, because that's how the brain has been conditioned to survive over time, is that if it can find safety in the short term, it's going to choose that over the long term. And that's where the prefrontal cortex has to come in and start applying more of a long-term frames towards our life, because when we're in addiction, everything is very much present moment oriented. My needs now in this moment, this needs to be fixed. I need to find my fix. Everything happens as a scarcity state right now. Whereas if we can slow down and start playing that long game, then we can start bringing in some more long-term gratification. Then we can start delaying our gratification. Then we can start planning for the future. And that's when we can start bringing in that prefrontal cortex, or that top brain inside of us, to really start helping making decisions that can affect us long-term and not just in the short moment. So in regards to relationship problems, I wanted to share this quote. It's by Pope John Paul II. And I chose it not because it's a religious quote. I just really appreciate what he says in this. So he says, in short, the problem with pornography is not that it shows too much of the person, but that it shows far too little. And I think that's really significant to understand, because what's happening in pornography is a complete reduction of a human individual to a piece of meat and a piece of skin. And I don't mean that lightly, but when we watch pornography, we're reducing the entire life. We're not watching pornography to tap into the dreams, the emotions, the wishes, the desires, the upbringing, the story behind who this person is, and recognizing their human experience and their suffering and what's going on with them. We're watching pornography to just see flesh and bodies rubbing against each other for a while, and that creates pleasure. And so with pornography, the problem with it, once again, is that not that it shows too much of in terms of skin and just nudity, but that it shows far too little about who the individuals that we are watching are in these videos. And So I'm going to dive into some of these and we can talk a little bit more about that as well. So one of the problems with pornography is that our brain is tricked into thinking that it is doing well. So because your brain is being tricked into thinking it is getting a healthy level of dopamine, it is reluctant to do tasks that require delayed gratification. That means creating intimacy, forming relationships, meaningful sex, working out, etc. So because our brain is tricked into thinking that it's doing well, it won't actually go out and seek out discomfort in order to create a meaningful life. And our meaning is found through our discomfort. Our meaning is found through our suffering. And if we choose the easy road consistently, that's where the pornography addiction can become so seductive and lead to a very depressive and shame spiral. And it can actually create a path to suicidal ideation, because their life becomes meaningless, because nothing is no longer giving us that same amount of dopamine that the pornography addiction has given to us. So porn causes higher levels of dopamine than sex. So sex is an activity that naturally produces the highest amount of dopamine in the brain. Pornography does not only not require risking vulnerability, but it produces higher dopamine. Which activity would your brain choose? High risk and lower dopamine, which is sex, or low risk and more dopamine, which is porn? So just to elaborate on that a little bit more. So with pornography, the levels of dopamine that are within the brain, when with sex, there is a lower amount of dopamine that is created, and it requires risk. It requires risk of rejection, risk of vulnerability, risk of intimacy, risk of getting our hearts hurt. Whereas pornography doesn't require any of those, and it gives a higher sense of dopamine. So that's why it's so seductive and dangerous, is because if I'm making the choice of going out and meeting people and talking to men or women who I find sexually attractive, then I'm not going to do that if I know that not only will I get more dopamine, but I don't have to risk any of that by watching pornography. So it's extremely dangerous to understand that in that cycle, pornography can very much affect even meeting people, let alone meeting people. But then if we're in a relationship, not actually connecting with that individual and risking rejection, because why would I want to go get hurt if I know I can just sneak off into a corner and isolate and watch pornography? So I think it's very difficult to be in a relationship and to take this other individual seriously in a relationship when we are watching pornography. And it can really cause a lot of uncomfortable feelings within the relationship for our romantic partners. If they think that we're watching pornography, they could go through a whole bunch of their own shame spiral of not thinking that they're attractive enough or lovable or good enough, that you still have to watch pornography. So pornography affects how we view sex as well. Like I mentioned earlier, pornography affects just our perception of sex in general. So as I wrote here, pornography involves actors, sex workers, children, and women who are being trafficked. It is not actual sex, and it changes how we view sex. So a lot of the pornography that we do watch is actually part of sex slave trading. A lot of the pornography that we watch is not actually individuals who are in love with each other. It is typically individuals who have maybe met 5 to 10 minutes before the shoot, who are high or drunk in some way, and who just ram bodies and scream for a couple of hours and then leave after that. So there's no meaningful connection that's necessarily created. A lot of the sex is kinky and can actually, in unhealthy ways, there's an argument that sometimes exploring those kinks can be healthy for the psyche. But a lot of the kinks that are being created right now, for instance, like young teen pornography, actually is creating a cycle or a stimulus and a trigger inside the male psyche to see a young girl and instantly become more aroused than perhaps regular. Not only more aroused, but more objectifying, and I believe could lead to acting out in unhealthy ways, such as rape or sexual misconduct. I don't think that's off the table when it comes to pornography addiction, because what happens is we're just objectifying. It becomes so much easier to take the human out of the equation in those situations. So a couple of solutions when it comes to pornography addiction. So first and foremost, with the solutions is to understand that what we are doing in addiction is that we're seeking a form of connection. The opposite of addiction is not withdrawal or not using. The opposite of addiction is connection. So that's what we're seeking in our addiction. And that comes from Gabor Mate. And to me, there are essentially two different forms of connection that we're looking for. So the first form of connection is the connection to self, a connection to something greater than ourselves, a connection to the capital S self, God, a higher power, whatever your particular word of choice is, creator, universe, Shakti, Shiva, the different gods inside of us, something inside of us that is greater than our perceived sense of self, of who we think we are, greater than the ego, greater than the thinking mind. And then we also have the connection to others as well. So connection to community, connection to other people, forming real relationships. We're a social creature. We do require those real relationships. And something to keep in mind here too is that our just like if we were to eat a bunch of sweet tarts and candy, that may taste really good, but we don't have the substance or the sustenance that will actually keep us alive in our day to day. So same thing with pornography. Pornography is like eating sweet tarts all day long. We're getting a good taste of it, but we're not getting the actual nutrients that our body needs in order to survive. We do need connection. We are dependent on other people, and acknowledging that is actually a healthy part of the human individuation process. So a couple of tips that I recommend if you are looking to quit pornography or start slowing down your usage is to delete and unfollow triggering social media accounts. So this means going through your social media accounts, unfollowing anything that could be provocative, blocking anyone perhaps on Snapchat that may not be healthy, not having bookmarks to unhealthy websites as well, going on YouTube and unrecommending any videos that pop up with provocative thumbnails. Any ads that come on that maybe start triggering you, you can ask YouTube or other ad platforms to not recommend those types of videos to you. Starting to take initiative and action towards your healing. Another big step is to go out into the woods. And I mean this literally, and I'm going to read what I wrote here. I do not mean this lightly. Part of the reason you're watching pornography is because there's a lack of authentic connection to yourself. You are out of alignment. So get back into nature, plan a 2 to 3 day camping trip, and leave your phone behind. And I don't mean that lightly. And if you're in a relationship right now, go by yourself. Go out in the woods, find who you are, reconnect to that part of yourself, and start bringing that dopamine in that brain chemistry back into balance and harmony by spending time outside. I don't mean just go into the woods if you enjoy being on the woods. I mean, go into the woods because you're a human being, and that is where our natural state of circadian rhythm and our natural body can decompress and come back into an alignment with who we really are. So go plan a trip, go find yourself. You only have this life that you're aware of, so make sure that you're spending it with the utmost care. And then also you can work with a therapist or a group. So you can work one-on-one with a therapist, or you could find a group of other like-minded men or women. And you can join SAA, which is Sex Addicts Anonymous, or SLA, which is Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. And these communities are awesome 12-step communities that will help you to find other individuals who are working through similar problems as yourself and help take you through a process that will help to alleviate your addiction. Really helps if you can do that in community as well and know that you're not alone with this. So working with specialists one-on-one. So I currently am taking on clients if you're looking to work through your own porn addiction. So if you are looking to work with someone, you can click the link below and schedule a free call with me. And on that call, we can explore some of the root causes of your addiction. We can talk about rediscovering meaning and connection in your life. And we can also discuss learning to develop healthy and meaningful relationships and help you to get back on track, and also provide a sense of accountability as well, if that's something that you're looking for. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, it would really help this channel to grow and help other individuals out there who are struggling with pornography addiction. Other than that, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care.